The Germans had turned the once quiet towns of the Normandy shore into a fortress. Juno Beach anchored the centre of the Allied line between the British beaches at Gold and Sword and put the Allies within striking distance of Caen and the road inland. The plan gave the Canadians one of the most ambitious objectives of any division that day: capture the three towns, push 10 miles inland, cut the road between Caen and Bayeux, and take the airfield at Carpiquet. The longest day for the Canadians began at Courseulles. The first wave came in at the western end, through the smoke of a bombardment that had already failed to break the German defence. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles came in against the German fortification named WN31, with C Company of the Canadian Scottish alongside them. The position was built into the dunes themselves, half a mile of sand hills with machine gun tubercules, and at its heart a casemate holding a 75mm gun. Every large gun emplacement aimed sideways and sighted along the beach. At 0749, the ramps dropped at Courseulles, just west of the River Saul. B Company of the Winnipegs had landed in front of the guns and crossed the open sand into the interlocking machine gun fire. Men started falling in the surf and on the beach, and by the time the company reached the shallow cover of the shingle, Captain Philip Gower stood up under fire, pushing the survivors through the gaps. Corporal Bill Claus was shot through the stomach and the legs before he cleared the surf. He kept pushing forward and reached a machine gun nest at the top of the beach. The wounded Claus managed to kill 2 of its crew before he died beside them. The survivors went at the tubercules and gun pits in the dunes one at a time. Grenades were thrown at the positions and the trenches behind them were cleared in hand-to-hand fighting and close quarters combat. The 75mm casement was the worst of them all. Lieutenant Aiken took a party of men against it, pushing through the wire and the trenches, and stormed the bunker at the point of the bayonet. The gun fell and nearly 8 of every 10 men who went in with him were killed or wounded taking it. As the Royal Winnipegs fought to push off the beach, out of the sea behind them came the DD tanks of A Squadron of the 1st Hussars. The rough seas and submerged traps had proven equally as devastating for the tanks as they did for the infantry, with only 7 DD tanks making it ashore. The tanks that made the beach now put their guns against the concrete fortifications, firing point blank into the positions the infantry had not yet reached. The German garrison began to give up the fight, and the crew of the machine gun casement behind the strong point came out with their hands raised. One by one, the guns of WN31 started to go quiet. East of the river mouth, the Regina Rifles hit WN29, the most heavily fortified position on the whole Anglo-Canadian front. On this stretch of the beach, the DD tanks had beaten the infantry in. 14 Shermans of B Squadron of the 1st Hussars were already working along the waterline, and they closed on the casements from the landward side and fired point blank into the openings. The 75mm gun was destroyed first, but the 88 kept firing and would not give up as easily. Round after round from the Shermans burst against the casemate, hit after hit striking around the aperture, and still the gun fought on. Beside the harbour, the 50mm was pouring round after round into the men on the beach. It drew the attention of a Sherman, who silenced it where it stood. In front of the eastern casemate, A Company of the Reginas was pinned flat on the sand, its commander shot down as he left the craft. Lieutenant Bill Grayson got up and ran at the wire alone, taking cover on the far side. He noticed a machine gun emplacement firing onto the beach. Grayson rushed forward towards the fortification, but got caught in the barbed wire surrounding the position. The machine gun traversed towards him, but by sheer luck the shots missed. Between the short bursts, he managed to free himself. Once again, he rushed forward and threw a grenade through the narrow opening and silenced the gun. The surviving Germans abandoned the position, and Grayson followed the garrison down into their zigzag trench with a pistol in his hand. Grayson arrived at the end of the trench into a makeshift bunker, where he heard shouts for "Kamerad," and shortly after, 35 Germans emerged with their hands raised. The trench had been the strongpoint's artery, the covered route that fed men to its guns, and with its garrison in Canadian hands, the 88 fell silent at last. Behind them, the British AVREs of the 26th Assault Squadron came up off the waterline, and their petards blew the concrete roadblocks off the beach exits. The walls were breached and the Reginas pushed into the town. Every man had memorised the layout in England. The streets divided into 12 numbered blocks, and they cleared the town the same way they had rehearsed it. C Company of the Reginas swung through the southern streets, breaching houses and clearing any strong points one by one. But the underground German trench network gave them an advantage. German infantry came up through tunnels behind the Canadians, and the Reginas had to turn around and fight positions they thought were already cleared. B Company of the Winnipegs forced the small bridge over the Saul's River and pushed across under fire onto the fortified island that sat between the river and the harbour channel, which was defended by 4 concrete positions. The Canadians took them one by one, charging into the German trenches in close quarters fighting. The remaining Germans, who were now surrounded and outnumbered, threw down their arms and surrendered. With the island cleared, the two halves of the beachhead joined across the water for the first time, but the fight was far from over. Behind the fighting, the British engineers of the 26th Assault Squadron were opening the way out for the rest of the invasion force. At Gray, the exit road had a trap. A flooded culvert had collapsed into a crater under the sand, and a Churchill AVRE called 1 Charlie slid in nose first and drowned. Its crew climbed out under mortar fire, and 3 of them were killed as they made their way back. The engineers bridged the crater over 1 Charlie's hull, and the armour of the western beachhead drove inland over the buried tank. By early afternoon, the shooting inside Courseulles had died away. Over 100 prisoners filed down onto the sand between the wrecked casemates. The tanks were rolling south of the town over the bridge crater, and along the coast to the east, the second town had been burning since morning. The DD tanks had been held back from Bernières, the seas judged too rough to launch them, and at 0812, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada came in with no armour at all in front of them. The craft carrying B Company had been pushed east along the coast due to the currents, directly in front of an untouched strongpoint. WN-28 held 2 50mm guns and scattered machine gun positions dug into the top of the wall. Amongst the wall was a concrete pillbox, and it was sighted directly at the Canadian landing craft. As the ramps dropped, the men were caught in the open with nothing but sand for 200 yards before the seawall. Around 65 men were killed or wounded in the first minutes, and some never stepped foot off the boats. Major Charles Dalton, commanding B Company, was shot in the head as he came off the ramp. The bullet opened his scalp to the bone, but he stayed on his feet and led what was left of his men across the sand to the foot of the wall, where the guns above could no longer angle down towards them. Against the wall, the dead and the wounded lay along the tide line in front of a sea house that would one day carry Canada's name. The wall was the only cover on the beach, but it was also a barricade preventing men in armour from getting off the sand. Lieutenant Herbert went over the top of the wall first, with Lance Corporal Tissier and Rifleman Tchaikovsky behind him. The 3 of them came at the pillbox with the machine gun, put grenades through the opening, and cleared it with automatic fire from their Sten guns. The pillbox went silent and opened the way into the German strongpoint, and along the wall, the rest of B Company came over and took the trenches and remaining guns behind it one at a time. A few hundred yards west, Major Charles Dalton's brother, Major Hume Dalton, had landed on a quieter stretch of sand with A Company of the Queen's Own Rifles, the naval bombardment finding its targets and destroying the emplaced guns that threatened the landings. Despite the machine gun and light arms fire, the men were off the beach quickly and into the town. 9 platoon of A Company was sent west against the machine gun emplacement that was firing on the flank of the company's landing. The emplacement turned out to be held in strength, and the Canadians were caught in the open. Machine gun and mortar fire erupted, with many men falling in the street. Sergeant Smith, who was wounded himself, gathered 10 men from those who were left. He made his way around the emplacement and put fire onto the Germans until the guns and mortars were silenced. He held there until the platoon was relieved, and stayed with his survivors until his company commander ordered him to find a medic. Inside the town, the fighting broke into the streets and gardens. German infantry had barricaded themselves in the houses and fired from the upper windows. The Canadians answered with grenades through the shutters, clearing the town house by house and moving towards the church whose spire had guided their boats in. By 0900 in the morning, Bernières was falling. The Queen's Own Rifles had been ashore for less than an hour and had already paid more than any Canadian battalion would pay on any beach that day. The DD tanks that should have landed in front of them were only now grounding out of the sea, guns traversing over a beach already carpeted with fallen Canadians. The wall that had killed so many was now blocking the way inland, and the AVREs and crab flails of the 80th Assault Squadron of the Royal Engineers had come in to break it. They used petards to blow the steel roadblocks off the exit ramp, and by 0930 the first gap was open and the Shermans of the Fort Garry Horse climbed through it into the town. Behind the assault battalions came the reserve of the 8th Brigade, the French Canadians of the Chaudières. The Chaudières marched up through the liberated streets and out of the southern exit towards Bayeux. Almost immediately, they came under fire. A pair of 88s stood dug into the fields on the rising ground at Les Perrucques, southwest of the town, and the first vehicles to top the rise were hit and burning within minutes. The column stopped and the advance stopped behind it. Lieutenant Moisan of the Chaudières took his platoon at the guns through the fields. On the way in, a German bullet struck the phosphorus grenade on his chest webbing and it ignited. Burning, he carried the attack into the position, overwhelming the gun crews in a frontal assault. The Germans surrendered, the guns fell silent, and the medics carried Moisan out of the line, his chest still smoking. The road out of Bernières was open. The Canadians and the British who had fought their way off the beach, over the seawall and through the town, were already marching out its exit. At Saint-Aubin, the Canadians of the North Shore Regiment were about to encounter the same seafront defences their fellow soldiers were facing at Courseulles and Bernières. The Shermans of Sea Squadron, Fort Garry Horse, advanced along the beach in search of an exit between the seawall until the 50mm gun began to fire into their flank. One after another, they were knocked out as they crossed its arc. Major Bray took his surviving Shermans off the sand, the only way that remained, straight through a marked German minefield where the 50mm gun wasn't pointed. He lost 3 more tanks on the mines, but the rest made it through and came around behind the town, and the 50mm strongpoint was surrounded. The firefight had looked to be at an end when white flags came out of the German gun position. The firing stopped and the men stood up to take the surrender, but as the Canadians approached, the Germans opened fire. After that, the fight for Saint-Aubin turned merciless. The gun in its pit fought on while the town fell around it, firing at anything that crossed its arc, and it took Bray's tanks and explosives from the engineers to finally silence it. Even then, the town was not done. The garrison went underground and came back up through the tunnels behind the attackers, and the North Shore spent the rest of the day clearing Saint-Aubin twice, street by street and cellar by cellar. With the strong point in the town finally silenced, the road south out of Saint-Aubin was open. By early afternoon, all 3 towns were in Canadian hands, and the front line stretched from the harbour at Courseulles to the last houses of Saint-Aubin, and the entire beachhead was in motion. Despite the early successes, the objective was still 10 miles away. The road between Caen and Bayeux was untouched and half the daylight was already spent. The Canadians broke south, chasing what was left of the day. The Winnipegs fought through St. Croix to Courseulles, where Lieutenant Jack Mitchell had silenced the machine gun covering a bridge, and the bridge was taken before the Germans could blow it. The Reginas crossed the Saules and pushed for Fontaine-Henry, where a single 88 on the high ground caught B Squadron of the 1st Hussars in the open and killed 6 of its tanks in minutes. The Queen's Own Rifles came through Bayeux, with its D Company pushed out ahead of them to Annecy. Lieutenant Bill McCormick's troop of the 1st Hussars had become separated from its infantry and carried on alone down the axis, the full 10 miles, until its tracks crossed the railway line between Caen and Bayeux. Of every unit that landed on the 5 beaches, those 3 tanks made the furthest push inland, touching their division's final objective. They sat on the empty railway, called for support that could not come, and decided to turn back. In the late afternoon, the Germans answered. The panzers of the 21st Panzer Division carried out the only German armoured counterattack of the day in the open scene between Juno and Sword Beach, driving for the coast. The British guns on the high ground across their path had broke the attack, and the panzers pulled back, leaving the slopes burning. Fearing the Germans would make another push, the order came down the whole Canadian line to stop where it stood and dig in for the night, and the drive for the Caen road ended one ridge short of it. For the Canadians, D-Day was over. 340 Canadians were killed on Juno and the ground behind it, with 574 wounded and 47 taken prisoner. Beside them fell 243 British casualties in the Juno sector. The road between Caen and Bayeux stayed in German hands. Carpiquet airfield would cost the Chaudière and the North Shores another battle a month later, and the northern half of Caen, marked for the first day, took another 33 days to fall. But the Canadians took every town on the beach and opened every exit with the help of the British engineers. On a beach whose cost was second only to Omaha, the Canadians drove deeper into France than any division in the Allied invasion, and created a perimeter that would allow the Allies to push on Caen and beyond.